Think about this for a second. You need to build a railroad. The whole point of a railroad is to move heavy things across impossible distances, mountains, deserts, rivers that flood every spring. That's what the locomotive is for. But here's the problem. Nobody talks about the locomotive itself weighs somewhere between 30 and 100 tons. It's made of iron and steel and fire. It needs to travel on rails to move. That's the whole point. So how do you get a 100-ton locomotive to a place that has no railroad? You can't drive it there are no tracks. You can't fly it. This is the 1830s. You can't exactly load it onto a truck because trucks don't exist yet. The thing that makes the locomotive revolutionary is the same thing that makes it nearly impossible to deliver. This is the great paradox that built America. And the answer to that paradox involves sailing ships rounding Cape Horn, wooden sleds dragged by teams of oxen over mountain passes, river barges that sometimes sank with their cargo, and a logistics nightmare that would make modern supply chain managers weep. This is how America moved locomotives to places that had no railroad. And the men who did it deserve to be remembered. Let's start at the beginning. Baltimore, 1830. A man named Peter Cooper has built something that changes everything. He calls it the Tom Thumb. Now, the Tom Thumb isn't much to look at by modern standards. It weighs less than 1 ton. It's small enough that a single horse could probably drag it down the street. But that's not the point. The point is that it works. Peter Cooper has proven that a steam-powered locomotive can actually pull cargo on American rails. Where before the Tom Thumb, people weren't sure. The British had done it, sure. But Britain is flat. Britain has gentle grades. America has the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains and about 1,000 rivers that flood whenever they feel like it. The Tom Thumb proved that American railroads were possible, and that created an immediate problem. Because suddenly, everyone wanted locomotives. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad wanted them. The South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company wanted them. Every investor with dreams of connecting cities and making fortunes wanted locomotives. But there was only one place making locomotives in 1830. England. So picture this. You're a railroad company in Baltimore or Charleston or Philadelphia. You've laid your tracks. You've built your stations. You've sold stock to investors who are expecting returns. And now you need the one thing that makes all of it work. You need a locomotive, and that locomotive is sitting in a factory in Newcastle, England, 3,000 miles away, across an ocean that takes 6 weeks to cross on a good voyage. Longer if the weather turns. This is where the story really begins. The first American locomotives weren't American at all. They were British, and getting them here was an odyssey. The Stourbridge Lion was one of the first. Built in England in 1829, it was purchased by the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company. The company needed it to haul coal from the mines in Pennsylvania. Getting the Stourbridge Lion to Pennsylvania required loading it onto a sailing ship in Liverpool. That ship then crossed the Atlantic, a journey that took over a month. When it arrived in New York, the locomotive had to be unloaded using cranes that were barely adequate for the job. Then came the real challenge. The Stourbridge Lion needed to travel from New York to Honesdale, Pennsylvania. There were no rails between those 2 points. That's why they were buying the locomotive in the first place. So they put it on a barge, they floated it up the Hudson River, they transferred it to another barge on a canal, they dragged it over portages where the canals didn't connect. This wasn't transportation. This was an extended negotiation with gravity and geography. When the Stourbridge Lion finally arrived in Honesdale, it had traveled for months. It had been lifted and lowered and floated and dragged. And here's the thing that nobody tells you. It was too heavy. The tracks in Honesdale had been built for a lighter locomotive. The Stourbridge Lion weighed 7 tons. The wooden rails couldn't handle it. On its very first test run, the locomotive performed beautifully. It moved under its own power. It proved that steam locomotion worked on American soil. And then it was retired. The tracks couldn't support it. All that effort to get it there, and it ran exactly once. This is what the early railroad men were dealing with. They were inventing transportation while simultaneously trying to transport the inventions, and they were making it up as they went along. By the 1840s, American companies had started building their own locomotives. This helped with some problems, but created others. The factories were in the east. Philadelphia had the Baldwin Locomotive Works. New Jersey had Rogers. Massachusetts had Lowell. These factories could build locomotives that rivaled anything the British made, but the railroads were pushing west, and west meant Ohio. West meant Indiana and Illinois. West meant crossing the Appalachians, which are not particularly tall mountains, but are endlessly complicated. Ridge after ridge after ridge, with rivers cutting through valleys that don't connect to anything useful. If you were building a railroad in Ohio in 1845, you still needed to get your locomotive there somehow. The most common method was the river barge. Picture a flatboat, maybe 80 feet long and 20 feet wide. It's essentially a floating platform with low sides. Now picture a locomotive sitting on that platform, 30 tons of iron and brass, with a tall smokestack and wheels that weigh more than most horses. The locomotive is chained down to keep it from shifting, because if it shifts, it's going into the river. And if it goes into the river, it's gone. 30 tons of iron sinks fast and stays sunk. These barges were poled down rivers by crews of men working in shifts. The Ohio River was the main artery. Locomotives would be loaded onto barges in Pittsburgh, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet. Then they'd float downstream, past Cincinnati, past Louisville, to wherever the new railroad was waiting. This worked reasonably well when the rivers cooperated. The rivers did not always cooperate. Spring floods could lift a barge and smash it against a bridge pier. Summer droughts could lower the water level until the barge scraped bottom and stuck fast. Winter ice could freeze the river solid, trapping cargo for months. And accidents happened. There are records of locomotives lost to the Ohio River, barges that struck submerged logs and broke apart, chains that snapped when the current surged. One locomotive in 1852 broke through the deck of its barge because the wood had rotted in ways that weren't visible from the surface. It went straight to the bottom in 15 feet of water. They tried to salvage it, sent divers down with ropes. The mud had already started swallowing it. They never got it back. The men who worked these barges knew the risks. They did the work anyway because the work paid and because someone had to do it. Now, river transport worked for destinations that rivers could reach, but America's geography doesn't cooperate that neatly. What about places like California? The California Gold Rush started in 1848. By 1850, San Francisco was exploding with people who needed supplies. By 1855, California businessmen were talking about building railroads. The Central Valley was flat and fertile. The coast needed connections to the interior, but California had no locomotive factories. California had no industrial base at all. Everything had to come from the east. And between California and the East Coast sat the entire American continent. The first option was the overland route. Take a locomotive apart, put the pieces in wagons, drag those wagons 2,000 miles across the Great Plains and over the Rocky Mountains. Nobody did this. The weight was prohibitive. A locomotive's boiler alone might weigh 10 tons. The wheels were cast iron, and cast iron cracks if you jostle it too much. The journey took months under the best conditions. And best conditions on the Oregon Trail was still a nightmare of dust and disease, and river crossings gone wrong. So they went around. The most common route was by sea. A locomotive would be loaded onto a ship in New York or Philadelphia. That ship would sail south, down the Atlantic coast, past the Caribbean, past Brazil, all the way to Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. Cape Horn is one of the most dangerous passages on Earth. The winds there blow constantly, funneled between Antarctica and South America. The waves can reach 60 feet. Ships that sailed around Cape Horn in the 1850s faced a real chance of never making it. They called the route around the Horn the sailor's graveyard. A ship carrying a locomotive wasn't nimble. The cargo shifted the center of gravity. In heavy seas, that made everything worse. Once a ship cleared Cape Horn, it sailed north along the Pacific coast, up past Chile, past Peru, past Mexico. Finally, after a journey that could take 4 to 6 months, it would arrive in San Francisco Bay. But the journey wasn't over. San Francisco is a port. The railroads being built were inland. The Sacramento Valley, the heart of California's agricultural potential, was 100 miles up the Sacramento River. So the locomotive went back onto a barge. By now, the men handling it were experts at this particular insanity. They'd done it in New York. They'd done it in New Orleans. They knew how to balance 30 tons of iron on a floating platform. They knew which ropes would hold and which would stretch. When the Central Pacific Railroad began construction in 1863, this was the supply chain they were working with. Locomotives built in the east, shipped around Cape Horn, barged up the Sacramento River, and finally loaded onto the tracks they were meant to run on. Each locomotive represented a 6-month journey and a small fortune in shipping costs. And the Central Pacific needed dozens of them. There was a faster route, the Panama route. Instead of sailing all the way around South America, ships could stop at the eastern coast of Panama. The cargo would be unloaded and transported across the isthmus. This was only about 50 miles. On the other side, a different ship would be waiting to carry the cargo up to California. In 1855, the Panama Railway opened. This made the crossing even faster. You could load a locomotive onto a train in Panama, haul it across the isthmus, and load it onto another ship. This cut months off the journey. A locomotive that would take 5 months via Cape Horn could reach San Francisco in 6 weeks via Panama. But the Panama route had its own problems. The jungle was disease-ridden. Malaria and yellow fever killed workers constantly. The men who unloaded ships and loaded trains worked in conditions that would be considered criminal today. Heat that felt like a physical weight, humidity that never broke, mosquitoes that carried death in their bite, and the route was expensive. You were paying for 2 ships instead of 1. You were paying for the railway crossing. You were paying a premium to save time. For urgent cargo, it was worth it. For a railroad company trying to control costs, it was a calculation without a clear answer. The Central Pacific used both routes. Some locomotives came around the Horn. Some came through Panama. Like each one arrived as a minor miracle, delivered by a chain of workers whose names were never recorded. But the real test came when the locomotives had to go where no ship could reach, the Sierra Nevada mountains. In 1863, the Central Pacific Railroad began construction in Sacramento, with the intention of pushing east through the Sierra Nevada to meet the Union Pacific coming west from Omaha. The Union Pacific had it relatively easy. Nebraska and Wyoming are not flat, but they're not the Sierra Nevada either. The Sierra Nevada is a wall of granite, peaks over 14,000 feet. Passes that stay snowed in until June. Grades so steep that early surveyors thought they were making mathematical errors. And to cross those mountains, the Central Pacific needed locomotives. But not just any locomotives, mountain locomotives. And heavier than the ones used on flat ground. More powerful, capable of pushing and pulling trains up grades that seemed designed by nature to be impassable. These locomotives had to be brought to the railhead, and the railhead was constantly moving east, up into the mountains, to places where only a few months earlier there had been nothing but wilderness. This is where the logistics became truly insane. The rails were being built by thousands of workers, most of them Chinese immigrants who had come for the gold rush and stayed because there was work. These men carved ledges into solid granite. They blasted tunnels through mountain peaks. They built trestles over gorges that seemed bottomless. And every piece of equipment they used had to be hauled up behind them. Rails, spikes, ties, tools, food, clothing, medicine, and locomotives. Point. There's a story from the winter of 1869. The Central Pacific was building a railroad to the west coast. The railroad pushed higher into the mountains. The supply line stretched to its breaking point. There's a story from the winter of 1866 that captures what this was like. The railroad had pushed through Donner Pass. Yes, that Donner Pass, where the Donner Party had starved and frozen and eaten their dead 20 years earlier. The Central Pacific was driving straight through the heart of it. That winter, the snow was 30 feet deep in some places. The workers were living in tunnels they'd carved beneath the snowpack, emerging to work and returning to their holes to sleep. Avalanches killed dozens. The cold was so intense that tools became brittle and snapped, and they needed more locomotives. The locomotives they had were working beyond their capacity. And the grades were steeper than they'd been designed for. The work trains were heavier than planned. Everything was being pushed to the limit. Getting additional locomotives to the railhead that winter required innovation born of desperation. They disassembled them. A locomotive was taken apart in Sacramento. The boiler separated from the frame. The wheels removed from the axles. The cab taken off piece by piece. Each component was loaded onto a wagon. Then teams of oxen dragged those wagons up the mountain. Imagine this. You're an ox driver in 1866. You're leading a team of 8 animals up a mountain road that's really just a rutted path through the trees. Behind you is a wagon carrying half of a locomotive boiler. It weighs 10 tons. The road is covered in ice. The oxen strain against their yokes. Their breath clouds in the air. The wagon creaks and groans with every movement. If a wheel breaks, if an ox stumbles, if the road gives way beneath the weight, people are going to die. You do this for days, up the mountain, through the snow, past the frozen bodies of men who didn't make it last week. When the components reached the railhead, they had to be reassembled. This meant machinists working in sub-zero temperatures, their fingers so cold they could barely grip their tools. It meant improvising repairs because parts had been damaged in transit. It meant testing the reassembled locomotive on track that had been laid just hours earlier. If anything went wrong during the reassembly, there was no replacement coming. Not for months. This is how the West was won. Not just with tracks and rails, but with the insane, by brutal logistics of getting the machines there in the first place. The Union Pacific, building west from Omaha, had different challenges. They had the Missouri River. Unlike California, which required ships to round Cape Horn, the Union Pacific could receive supplies by river. Steamboats carried locomotives up the Missouri from St. Louis. The river was navigable, at least part of the year, but the Missouri was fickle. Spring floods could sweep away entire shipments. Summer droughts could make the river impassable for months. And the river didn't reach all the way to the mountains. Once the railroad pushed past Omaha, past the Platte River Valley, into the high plains of Wyoming, the supply line had to adapt. By 1867, the Union Pacific had a functioning railroad behind it. New locomotives could be delivered by rail to the current end of track. This sounds simple, but remember that the track was being laid at a furious pace, sometimes miles per day. The railhead was a moving target. Supplying that moving target required a level of organization that didn't really exist yet. They invented it as they went. There's a term that came out of this period, hell on wheels. Hell on Wheels was the temporary town that followed the railroad. As the tracks pushed west, the workers needed places to sleep, eat, drink, and spend their money. Entrepreneurs followed them, setting up tents and shacks that could be disassembled and moved to the next stopping point. These towns were rough. Violence was common, law was optional, but they were also logistics hubs. Supplies flowed through them, and that included locomotive parts when something broke down on the line. The Union Pacific was learning in real time how to supply an army of workers building across a continent. They made mistakes, they learned, they adapted, but they also lost things. Locomotives that derailed on hastily laid track. Cargo trains that missed the schedule and arrived after the railroad had moved on. Supplies that sat rotting in depots because nobody had coordinated the paperwork. The race to complete the Transcontinental Railroad was as much a logistical competition as it was a physical one, and both sides knew it. The Central Pacific, with its 6-month supply line around Cape Horn, was at a constant disadvantage. Every delay meant locomotives stuck on ships. Every miscalculation meant work crews sitting idle. So they got creative. In 1868, with the race entering its final phase, the Central Pacific did something remarkable. They built a small fleet of ships that shuttled constantly between San Francisco and Panama. They stockpiled locomotives in warehouses in Sacramento, accepting the cost of keeping expensive machinery sitting idle so that it would be ready when needed. They developed a system where supply requests could be telegraphed from the railhead to Sacramento, then relayed to agents in Panama, then wired to suppliers in the East. It was a primitive version of just-in-time logistics. invented out of necessity, and they pushed their existing equipment harder than it was designed to go. There are records of locomotives being run until they literally fell apart. Boilers that should have been retired kept in service because there was no replacement. Engineers who knew their machines intimately, who could hear when something was about to fail and nurse it through just one more run. The men who operated these locomotives were a different breed. They had to be. You're running a locomotive in 1868. The track ahead was laid yesterday. Nobody has really tested it. The grade is steeper than anything this locomotive was designed for. You're hauling a train of supplies that weighs more than it should. If the track gives way, if a spike wasn't driven properly, if the grade is too steep for your brakes, you're going into the canyon below. There's no rescue coming. There's no safety system. There's just you and the machine and the mountain. These men ran those locomotives anyway, because the work had to be done. On May 10, 1869, the two railroads met at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory. The famous Golden Spike was driven. The continent was connected. What the photographs don't show is what it took to get those locomotives there. Jupiter, one of the locomotives at the Golden Spike ceremony, had come from the east. It had been shipped around Cape Horn. It had been barged up the Sacramento River. It had been hauled piece by piece over the Sierra Nevada when the tracks weren't finished yet. The locomotive facing it, Union Pacific number 119, had come up the Missouri River. It had survived the chaos of Hell on Wheels towns. It had run on track that was barely worthy of the name. These two machines, representing years of impossible logistics, met in the Utah desert. And we remember the Golden Spike. We remember the photograph of the two locomotives facing each other. We remember the celebration. We don't remember the men who loaded those locomotives onto ships. We don't remember the ox drivers who dragged components through mountain snow. We don't remember the barge crews who navigated flooded rivers with irreplaceable cargo. Their names aren't in the history books, but they should be. The story of American railroads is told as a story of visionaries, the Big Four who financed the Central Pacific, the shareholders who believed in progress, the engineers who surveyed routes through impossible terrain, and those people deserve credit. But the physical labor of moving 100-ton machines across a continent, before the machines themselves could do the moving, fell on people who history has forgotten. They were Irish immigrants fleeing famine. They were Chinese workers treated as expendable. They were black freedmen looking for opportunity in a nation that had just emerged from civil war. They were farmers' sons who needed the wages. They lifted and hauled and dragged. They worked in heat and cold. They drowned when barges sank. They were crushed when equipment shifted. They died of diseases they couldn't name in climates they didn't understand. And they delivered the locomotives. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the problem didn't go away. It just evolved. Railroads were spreading everywhere. Every small town wanted a connection. Every mining district needed rails to move ore. Every timber operation wanted locomotives to haul logs. And locomotives were getting heavier. By the 1870s, a standard freight locomotive might weigh 40 tons. By the 1880s, 60 tons. By the turn of the century, 100-ton locomotives were common. The logistics of moving these machines continued to challenge everyone involved. Bridges that could handle wagon traffic couldn't handle locomotive weight. Roads that existed on paper didn't exist in reality. The gap between where locomotives were built and where they were needed seemed to grow even as the railroad network expanded. There's a story from 1882 that captures this perfectly. A mining company in Colorado needed a locomotive for a narrow gauge line they were building. The closest railhead was 40 miles away, over a mountain pass. The locomotive was delivered by rail to the nearest station. Then it was taken apart. The boiler went on one wagon, the frame on another, the wheels on a third. Mule teams dragged these wagons over the pass. The road, such as it was, climbed over 8,000 feet. The air was thin enough that the mules labored for breath. The men weren't much better off. It took 3 weeks to move the locomotive 40 miles. When it was reassembled at the mine, the first thing the engineer noticed was that something wasn't right. One of the drive wheels had been damaged in transit, a crack that hadn't been visible. The locomotive ran for 2 months before the wheel failed completely. Getting a replacement wheel over that same pass took another 2 weeks. This was the reality that history books gloss over. The frontier wasn't conquered by abstract progress. It was conquered by men moving iron and steel through terrain that didn't want them there. There's something else that gets lost in the celebration of American railroads. These locomotives were dangerous to move, but they were also dangerous to operate. Early locomotives exploded. Their boilers were pushed beyond safe limits. Their safety valves failed. Their fireboxes overheated. A boiler explosion wasn't like a car accident. It was a bomb going off, scalding steam, shrapnel of iron. Anyone nearby didn't have a chance. The men who drove these locomotives, who stoked their fires and monitored their pressures, were taking their lives in their hands every day. And so were the men who moved them. Loading a 30-ton locomotive onto a barge meant working with ropes and chains and improvised cranes. A rope under tension that snaps becomes a weapon. A chain that slips can bring the whole load down in an instant. There are no comprehensive records of how many men died moving locomotives before the tracks were laid. Some companies kept records. Most didn't. Workers were cheap, and the frontier was unforgiving. But the deaths happened. Drowned when barges sank, crushed when chains broke, fallen from mountain roads that gave way beneath the weight, frozen in mountain passes, killed by diseases in Panamanian jungles. These deaths were the price of progress, and the men who paid that price have been largely forgotten. When we talk about building America, we should talk about this. The railroads were a triumph. They connected the coasts. They opened the interior. They made possible a level of commerce and migration that transformed the nation. But they were built on the backs of workers who did impossible things because the work needed to be done. Moving a 100-ton locomotive to a place with no railroad is, when you think about it, absurd. It's a paradox without a clean solution. You need the railroad to move the locomotive. You need the locomotive to justify the railroad. The men who solved that paradox didn't solve it with engineering elegance. They solved it with muscle and sweat and stubbornness. They said, this thing needs to be there, and they put it there. Ox teams and river barges and sailing ships and mule wagons, ropes and chains and improvised cranes, frozen winters and malarial summers, broken equipment and makeshift repairs. They did it anyway. And when the golden spike was driven at Promontory Summit, when the crowds cheered and the telegraphs clicked out the news to a waiting nation, those workers weren't in the photographs. They were already working on the next impossible delivery. Because the frontier wasn't done expanding. The locomotives kept getting heavier, the demand kept growing. For decades after 1869, men continued to move locomotives to places that had no railroad. Branch lines into mining districts, narrow gauge routes into timber country, extensions into territories that would become states, the same brutal logistics, the same dangerous work, the same forgotten labor. The next time you see a photograph of an old locomotive, think about this. Before that machine ever ran on rails, it made a journey that was just as remarkable as any trip it would ever take. It crossed oceans, it climbed mountains, it floated down rivers that wanted to swallow it. It was taken apart and put back together. It was dragged by animals that couldn't understand what they were hauling. Men died getting it there, and men lived their whole lives around the work of moving these machines, developing skills that no one teaches anymore. Solving problems that we've largely forgotten existed. They were part of something larger than themselves. They knew it, even if they didn't have the words for it. America was being stitched together, mile by mile, rail by rail, and the locomotives that did the stitching had to arrive somehow. This is that somehow. Not elegant, not efficient, not celebrated, just done, because it had to be. So the next time someone tells you that American progress was inevitable, that the railroads were simply a natural evolution of technology and capital, remember this: nothing was inevitable. Every locomotive that reached its destination was a small miracle of human effort. Every rail line that opened for service represented problems solved by people who didn't have manuals or precedents or easy answers. They figured it out because they had to. And the nation we live in today connected and mobile and taking for granted that goods and people can move from coast to coast, was built on their work. The railroads didn't build themselves. Men built them. And before the building could even start, men moved 100-ton machines across a continent that wasn't ready to receive them. They deserve to be remembered,